that we've been talking lately about organizational change. So it makes a lot of sense for us to expand that conversation, do some more reflection and connection about it. We were specifically talking about this idea of like going from perspective to practice and really thinking through how, yes, they can be ideas and they can be conceptual, but where is it that the rubber meets the road and we go ahead and really get clear on the how and what is it, how does this turn into something that really can be used by a leader and made to help them grow, develop, maybe even faster into their leadership, their ultimate leadership, the vision of themselves and their strengths as a leader. Before we go any further, please introduce yourself a little bit so that everybody else knows who I'm talking with.
All right. So Dr. Robert O. Wilson Jr., originally from New Jersey, born and raised, living in North Carolina now, do a lot of work in leadership and organizational development, education, training. One of my passions is doing it from the inside out. What does that mean? How do we think about leadership? How do we actually practice it? How do we create the type of organizational environments that really thrive and lends itself to building more effective teams and leadership and opportunities for growth, being able to have conversations like social intelligence, spiritual intelligence, and occupational intelligence, emotional intelligence, and how that translates into wellness. That's kind of been my background. Started out initially in the field of mental health, kind of moved into things like NLP and hypno regarding just personal and professional development. And then that kind of morphed into how does personal professional development connect with leadership and organizational development. A big part of what I do is around how we educate leaders and organizations intentionally and strategically. Also, how do we incorporate within that education things like self-determination theory and transfer of learning theory, where we actually identify what motivates people internally and externally, and how that actually transfers into implementation, practice, process, policy, systemic change, growth, and opportunities. So just a little bit of a synopsis of kind of what I do.
Which is why I love talking with you so much, because all of those things are like, yep, absolutely. Let's get into it. I should probably introduce myself as well. So I'm Angela Herbert White, and I am a leadership coach, consultant, speaker, and trainer. A lot of the leadership work I do, first of all, comes from both the personal and professional development standpoint, which I think is why you and I, when we talk, really share, just bounce around so many ideas, because we both are very much about both the personal and the professional parts of someone's lives, all the aspects. Another thing that I focus on is women as leaders and all of the ways they connect the many pulls, many forces in their lives into a whole, happy, thriving experience for themselves, a thriving life for themselves. A lot of the work that I do is about creating space for women to really kind of sort through those moments of getting a promotion and feeling like they need to have more confidence in order to step into that position, or knowing that as a leader, their expectations for them that maybe they haven't really seen a model of how it's done in a way that really works for them, or knowing that the way leadership is supposed to happen, or the image that is thrown out there of something that they need to do in their particular industry doesn't quite fit. So helping them to navigate how it's typically done and how to integrate how they do their work best. So it's very much a strengths-based approach to leadership, very much about acknowledging and validating who someone is as a starting point and helping them, same as you too, that internal, right? Helping them to start on the internal acknowledgement, understanding of these are the great gifts I bring. So when we start there, we have so much more to give and we can make so much more impact. And honestly, when we do it that way, we're not just preventing burnout, but we're moving in the opposite direction of burnout, because we're moving into lives and leadership that we get really excited about, because we're starting from the things that are most important to us and the gifts that we have the strongest ability to give. So I get really excited about that too.
I get out. I think I'm thinking how awesome that is, even though I know this about you, but still hearing it is still pretty amazing to hear. And it's so empowering, because I think what happens is helping people to recognize, first of all, they have power
Yes.
in order to be empowered. And what is that? And what does that look or sound like? There are so many terms, especially as leadership and leadership, that we focus on usually qualities and characteristics.
Yep.
But one of the reasons I think when we talked about even recording our conversation was what's the perspective of it? And then also, how do you go from your perspective to your practice?
Yep.
Because there are so many different filters that we have in our perspective, right? In leadership, and what other people think leadership is for you. And I think you had something recently where you're talking about the first person you lead is yourself
Yep.
and really helping people to navigate. And we both focus on that. The thing I think becomes really critical is how do you navigate not only your life as a leader and your employees or those you lead, but how do you navigate yourself from the inside out?
Yes.
Right. And so that's what kind of leads to even our conversation about organizational change, right?
Yep.
How do we change organizations from the inside out? How do we change leadership from the inside out?
Yeah, I think we're going to be getting into that really. It's so much a reflection, like what goes on inside us as a reflection of how change is navigated externally or organizationally or culturally. And when we have a better connection with who we are and how we navigate change, we realize that that is what we can also bring at a much more intentional and strategic level as we navigate change within our organizations too. I want to ask you, so we can have some questions to bounce back and forth. I'm wondering, perspective to practice for you, an example or an experience you've had of navigating change and how you did it, how you went about navigating a change in your life personally or professionally.
One of the first ones, probably I go way back to when I actually became a supervisor. I had an opportunity just fresh out of college, had a job, just happy to have a job out of college. And I was working at a facility. And within 8 months of being there, I had an opportunity to be a supervisor or being leadership. And I didn't want it. And so I had a really good supervisor who said, Robert, you have the abilities and skills to already do that. Why don't you? And I think my answer at that time was, I don't really want to tell people what to do. I just want to come to work and do my job and leave. And what he ended up sharing was, he said, well, when you are running the shift, and basically it was on seniority. So there were a lot of times that when I was working, it was shift work, that I would actually be the lead on a shift. And one of the things he said, yeah, you should be a leader naturally like you are, just not get paid for it. And I said, what?
Mm-hmm.
Kind of looked at him like, and what he showed me was, you are already a leader. You are already in a leadership role. You actually care about what you do, and you care about how the shift runs and the people who run the shift, the people you serve with, and also people that you serve. He said that's what leadership is about. It's really not about just telling people what to do. It's about helping people to navigate and to shift. So the first part of my leadership, or that change, was realizing I was a leader and I had to change my perspective so I could change my practices. Because the funny thing was, my practices were already implemented, but my perspective was off. So they didn't necessarily connect or align. And that was where my first shift happened, or that first change. So I had to change what my view of leadership was, and also recognize how important it is to have quality leaders in organizations, to really get, not just get results and for performance, but to create the type of environment conducive to cultivating leaders, teams, purpose, mission, goals, and really kind of put all those together more cohesively and more harmoniously. And
Yep.
so that was my first example.
That's so funny. I often talk about being a reluctant leader. Like that was a whole lot of me, like people saying, Angela, you're giving me leadership opportunities before I saw myself as a leader, before I really knew that I could lead my own way. It didn't have to be that image of like telling people what to do. So I call myself a reluctant leader for a really long time until I figured
I
out
like
how
that.
to do it in a way that really did connect for me too. Like that's exactly what you're saying. Oh, I'm doing these things, like I can use those skills that I actually already have and build on those. I don't have to tell people what to do, which is really cool. The other thing I think about that too, from my own perspective, I was in an organization where my boss, it was one of my favorite jobs ever. I loved working with my boss, because she had such a different perspective on leadership, it was very eye-opening. So going from a reluctant leader to being offered a position in leadership in this organization, to then being promoted to another position in leadership, and me going, oh, wait, this is the first time I really am a boss, right? I like supervise people, didn't know what to do, didn't know how to tell them what to do, that kind of thing. But watching her was so eye-opening, because she really had, the way I describe it is, she led with love. I mean, she showed that you can actually start from the perspective of recognizing the humanity and what's best about the people on your team, and then you can have that be your guiding perspective in your leadership. You don't have to be the heavy, you don't have to be the bad guy or the bad cop or whatever ever want to say it. You can lead with love. So that was such an important perspective for me. And I would say that, like, so eventually I came to lead that organization, and I actually came to lead the organization at a time of crisis, where it was like, we were either going to sink or swim. The fiscal picture was changing, the political picture was changing. We were nonprofit. And so it was going to be, really, can we find the funding that we used to get the funding over here that is no longer there? And so now we got to find a whole new, in a really, really short period of time. I came on board knowing I didn't know if we were going to definitely make it. And it turns out we didn't make it as our own organization, but we were able to merge our mission into several other organizations, because that was what made the most sense to keep the work going. But that whole thought of her showing me to lead with love was, when I walked into the crisis, when I walked into the change that I knew was coming, was key in me setting a perspective that I could then shift into practice, that I could navigate through the change, knowing that what I'm going to keep at the forefront is this amazing, amazing team, everyone on it who, they're going to need to know, do I have a job? Do I not have a job? What is changing about my job? And if I start from love, I can be more transparent with them. I can collaborate with them and have them part of a process, the process when it makes sense. And beyond all that, the reason we were all showing up to work every day was because of the purpose of the organization to begin with, which was children and families. So if we could all rally around the fact that, yes, things are changing, but we are never going to change the level, the quality that we are bringing in our service, until our very last day. If our doors close, that's what we're going to bring. That was huge to keep that in mind. So navigating through change, I think it was and is really key to start with that internal, what's going to be the most important to me? What are going to be the guiding factors? What's the perspective that's really going to carry me through? And at that time, and into the future as well, it really is leading with love. So sounds kind of corny, but it's true and it works. So there we go.
I like it. There are so many types of leadership. And I think what happens is people get connected or they get anchored in only one type.
Yeah.
And leadership is multi-tiered, multi-layered, and it really takes a lot of agility. I would say cultural and leadership agility to kind of go back and forth based on the need, the opportunities, the time, even the challenges.
Yeah.
But what you said really kind of resonates with me, and it kind of leads into our next question. So, and I want to kind of just pose this for us. The next question is, what do you think is the most important skill or perspective to access when experiencing personal or professional change?
Yeah. So, well, it's really what you're saying too. It's just knowing that there doesn't have to be one particular leadership style, and stopping a minute and figuring out for yourself the approach that you will best take. That's the strengths, the power, the skills, the experiences you bring, gets you out of the traps of what it's supposed to be done this way, or down the road when things get even harder, it gets you out of the comparison trap of, I'm not doing it right because it doesn't look like this, or my results aren't their results, or that leader's results. So I think the more you tap into your own strengths, the more, and it's not even like a one-time tap, know your strengths and then you can go forward, but it's like a continuous cycle of going, okay, how am I showing up? What are the things that I'm doing really well? Where are the gaps that I need to understand? Maybe some of those gaps I need to strengthen, maybe some other of those gaps, I just got to realize I have to ask for help here, because then I'm going to focus on the things that I'm strongest in. And that's going to be a higher level impact for me. And then I can engage other people to fill those gaps. I don't have to pretend to be what I'm not. And I don't have to fall into that, well, I'm supposed to do it this way trap. Actually, like you were talking about self-determination theory, it's so much about that too. If you can align yourself in the ways that are most of highest value to you, the ways that you are most competent, then you go out into the world, into your leadership at a much higher level, and you can weather change a whole lot better than if you're just kind of flailing around and trying to find the way you're supposed to do it. It's kind of a long way to say, don't do the supposed to, go with your strengths.
Also, in addition to that, I think what makes me think about mindset versus mind shift,
Okay.
right?
Yeah.
Where it's this fixed way of we've done it that way for years, or this is what it looks like, and it looks that way in every situation and circumstance, and it doesn't. But being open to realizing that part of preparing for change is cultivating your ability and skills
Yep.
to actually change.
Yep.
I always find it really interesting because change is inevitable, but typically people still have a challenge or a problem with changing. I think what happens, and this is why I think we even talked about from perspective to practice, because my perspective of change, and I think about it often when I work with organizations around conflict resolution
Mm-hmm.
and communication skills. A lot of times conflict is communicated as something wrong that needs to be fixed, something that's not right, and something I just need to hurry up and rectify. What I realized was conflict a lot of times is not always a challenge, but an opportunity to be present in that moment and kind of recognize what's going on. And we don't always have to fix things,
Yep.
but maybe even just finding out and noticing why things are happening.
Yep.
This is like, I think where things like mindfulness become really helpful,
Mm-hmm.
because you become aware, you become curious, but without judgment.
Mm-hmm.
It allows you to kind of just fill the space of, if I need to do something different, what's my capacity here?
Yep.
Do I need to cultivate more skills or more development
Yep.
to be more apt and better prepared to shift,
Mm-hmm.
versus the filter that I have and how I've seen it, or even our outcomes?
Yep.
A lot of times we go, well, this is not the outcome we want, but how do we get to that outcome? Like, let's go to the outcome first instead of just all the steps to get there, because a lot of times it's hard to get there from here,
Mm-hmm.
especially if your way of thinking is already limited. So I think recognizing what that mindset is, being able to access, kind of like what we say in coaching, a beginner's mind.
Yeah.
It could be somebody you've coached multiple times, but every session you allow it to be new and fresh, and you show up with that beginner's mind to allow it to speak to what you're doing now, not what we've done in the past or what we want to, not, and sometimes even what you want to do in the future. So I think accessing that beginner's mind is really helpful, and I think it is a skill. It is a skill to intentionally be in the space of just listening without judgment and allowing the information to be presented in a way where we can actually effectively and efficiently work with it.
Yeah. We kind of don't get unnecessarily caught up in, oh no, this is conflict, or oh no, this is change. And we really kind of go, okay, look at the pieces and come with that beginner's mind of to look at it, and maybe bringing in some other people to help shift some perspectives too. If you're not getting that shift on your own, there's nothing wrong with that. In fact, it can be really, really great.
There's this exercise that I saw the late Bob Proctor do. What he would say is, if you're at a table and you're in a chair and you have an issue, write it down on a piece of paper and look at that issue and just take a different stance, like somebody that you would know, how would they handle this? Then he basically would go around the table in different positions. And in NLP, that's kind of what we call perceptual position, where it's like looking at it from the first person point of view, second person view, as a third person point of view, and just being able to see as you change your position, your perception changes. I think that's a big part of what we're talking about too, is what's the perspective, and when you know that you can actually change it, because I think a lot of times we don't recognize that we can change our perspective.
Mm-hmm.
Right, we're trying to change the outcome, but not necessarily the perspective. Because if you change the perspective, the outcome automatically changes.
Yes, absolutely. Like, yeah, recognizing that you're stuck in this, so you want to expand it, and then you can get somewhere different too. So I want to ask you to kind of moving into another question. We've been talking about the leader's self-awareness or self-acknowledgement of where they're coming from and how they can shift their perspective, how they can acknowledge their own power, how they can realize that they can go about leading and navigating change in a way that maybe is unique to them or doesn't have to be the way that they've only seen it done before. So that self-awareness is really important. The next thing that I think would be really fun to talk about, though, is how can leaders prepare themselves and their teams for change? Because it's inevitable. We know it's inevitable. So what can they do for themselves and for their teams to help everybody get ready for or be equipped to navigate that change together as a team?
The first is communication skills.
Okay. Yep.
You go, well, Robert, that's pretty easy. Well, it's not, because when we say communication, we're mostly talking about what are you telling somebody else? Are they getting the message? Do they know how to respond to it? But when we communicate, you're actually communicating to that filter or that perspective that we just talked about that you might not know exists in that individual.
Yeah.
So I think first communicating what the change is, or even, and let me take a step back, asking your folks what they think the change is.
Okay.
What needs to change and why? I think just that dialogue alone will bring a lot of awareness. And what you might start hearing is people's fears, people's concerns. And the reason I say it that way, because I've worked in with organizations where there was a lot of a lack of trust and a lot of people feeling devalued and overlooked, because when they shared their concerns, it was like, well, that's not an issue, or kind of get over it. That doesn't address the issue. What it does is it just kind of sweeps it under the rug.
Right. Right.
Then you tell folks we're going to change regardless, and you don't support them. So I think the first area is communication. I think with communication, both externally and internally, intra communication, navigating some of those challenges for folks. Then the other end of it is, and this kind of goes into some of the other skills, like I think emotional intelligence, social intelligence, and spiritual intelligence. Those are things that really kind of resonate with me off the top of my head. The reason I say those, because emotional is not just the emotions of your folks, but your emotions even in leading. Once you become aware of those emotions, how can you utilize that, or what can we do to implement that in your leadership practices? You say, well, what about social? Because even though you might be a leader, you're a person. How we interact socially makes a major difference in the workplace. You know, when you have environments conducive where people can talk and trust each other and have open dialogue and communication, it changes the game. Then you say, well, why would you add spiritual? Because in a lot of workplaces, we don't talk about things like religion or what have you. What I'm saying is, I'm not necessarily saying it has to be religious, but when it's spiritual, when we're talking about the purpose, when you as a leader take the perspective of part of my role is developing people, not just employees. I'm not just training you to do the best job, but when I'm developing you to be the best person who does the best job, it's a game changer. When organizations start looking at their role as the development of individuals in not only skills, but in purpose, like what's the mission? What's the goal? Starting there, I don't think that's an end point, but I think that's a great starting point. And it will give you so much data, if you will, and information that can be used in a strategic plan.
Yeah.
An actionable strategic plan. This is where things like SMART goals will be able to come in and be really helpful for folks as they start dialogue. I think a couple things happen here. You have dialogue, discussion, digestion, and demonstration. You know, it changes how you talk. It changes how you share. It changes what they can take and glean from it. Then you get a chance to actually demonstrate how it's applicable, which really helps reinforce people not feeling alone. And then going back to what you said from the beginning, what the question is, that it helps people to be able to change.
Yep. Yeah.
Because now I actually have some, it's tools for your toolbox. And I always tell people, if I can be honest, there's a lot of tools in my toolbox I don't use. So not just tools in my toolbox, but knowing when, where, and how to use them changes my competence and my confidence to use them. Now I'm a employee or a person within this organization or member of this organization who has tools to prepare for change.
Mhm.
So when change comes, it's not something like, oh my goodness, change is coming. It's like, okay,
Okay, I got it.
I
All
got
right,
it.
yeah. So you said a few things that I was writing down some of the words you said, and I'm thinking about different terms in my paradigm that match up too. So when you talk about, communication skills and asking them, what do they think the change is? You get to hear their fears and concerns and having it so that it's not just okay, I hear you, get over it, we're doing the change anyway, but really making sure that people feel heard, that they have a voice, that they know that this is change. This is a process we're all going through together. And your voice, I'm not checking a box asking you these questions, but your voice is welcome, deserved, essential to be spoken in this room. You have got to be a part of what we're going through together. Huge.
Yeah, that was like in the world of mental health first aid. That's what we call listening non-judgmentally, and the goal is to actively listen so that people feel heard, understood, and acknowledged.
Yes.
I'm heard, I'm acknowledged. You actually taking the time to understand my now whether you agree with them is a whole nother story,
Yeah.
right? You're not necessarily having to approve of anything, but you meet people where they are, not necessarily where you think they should be.
Yes,
Right.
yes, yes, yes. And you don't know where you get to go from there. You get that's mind shift as well, right? Meeting them where they
Yeah.
are means that everybody can shift together through the change too. So the other thing I think about a lot, I've been doing a lot of work with organizations, like individual leaders and teams, and navigating through change, leadership changes in particular. Like, the leader of the organization leaving and then bringing in someone new and all of that. One of the things that I've found to be super, super important in either preparing the team before the change happens, or even if it's like a sudden change, one of the first things that I have needed to address has been trust and figuring out where they currently are in their levels of trust of each other. Because there's going to have to be many, many moments through change where without any trust at all, that's going to be really difficult to go through the change. So what can we do to acknowledge the places that we mutually respect each other, that there is mutual trust already, and what can we do to maybe shore up some spaces that we've either taken for granted? We need to really have a demonstration of trust, or we can safely get ourselves to a place of trusting each other through the change. When I think about that, the clearest version I've ever seen is with Brene Brown's work in Dare to Lead. She's got braving trust is a very big component of leadership. There's a smaller version because we can't do it all at once, right? So there's a smaller version. One of the most important elements that I've seen in my work with organizations navigating through change is assessing where the current levels of trust are, and then really figuring out what we need to shore up, or how we can take ourselves through a process together of gaining or building or strengthening trust. Brene Brown has a few frameworks for this. She calls it living big. It's BIG, which B is boundaries, I is integrity, and G is generosity. B is boundaries. Really, it can set up an organization or a team that maybe is not so high on trust, knowing where the boundaries are, knowing what's clear, where the fears, where the concerns, how can we build some frameworks and some parameters that are boundaries that people can feel safe to continue to build trust from there. Going into a team and going, you got to trust each other, that doesn't cut it. But if we're really, really clear on like, I'm comfortable trusting you to this point, and I need to make sure that at this moment I got this boundary. And in the future I can assess and maybe not have it, but that really helps people to feel safe in their development of trust. Integrity, her quick definition is choosing courage over comfort. It's the thing that needs to be said, making sure you're expressing. I find that really helpful in helping people to feel like, yes, we want to hear what truly is important to them, and to feel like they have a safe space, although they might need to be courageous in saying the words. There's some boundaries and some safety in speaking up and gaining that trust. Then generosity is assuming best intent. So, I mean, we're all going through the change together, and we're going to have to just kind of extend some grace to each other. We're going to have to be generous with our understandings and assumptions of where the other person's coming from, that they're not actually trying to sink this ship. They really are doing the best they can too, maybe having an off day every now and then, but that generosity is key. When you feel like When you start this exercise with a team of living big and building trust, even if they're at a place of low trust at the beginning of the change process, over time, not forced, but really helping to have a framework and check in with them on how is it going and where are those touch points where maybe there isn't a whole lot of trust, and we can work on that too. But just being able to have that filter, I think, has been really, really helpful in teams navigating through change in a way that can acknowledge where their trust is and how they might be opportunities to grow more trust.
When you said that, as you were saying it, I got this image of, that trust exercise where people fall backwards.
Yeah.
And, somebody has to catch you, and it's like, not knocking it, but just want to kind of say something to consider. Why do I have to fall before you help me?
Yeah.
That's kind of like my thought on that is often when we talk about change, we talk about change from a place of all the uncomfortable things that happen.
Yep.
Like even what you mentioned, I thought it was interesting, comfort over courage. But how about we become comfortable being courageous?
Yeah, exactly. Yes.
Right?
That's the boundary.
Right. And start recognizing intentionally and on purpose, building trust and building rapport, and not just waiting for rapport to happen automatically. People go, well, it's organic. Yes, it is organic, but it's also intentional, because you might have individuals who've not known how to organically create connection. Yep. Or community. And I know now there's a lot of talk around communities and having different communities support. And one of the things and some of the work I do, I facilitate like learning, action, networking communities. One of the things that I have found helpful in those is not necessarily selling people on the idea that this community is going to do all these things for you. What I found helpful is asking them how this community can serve you. How can you serve this community? Because it's not only adding value, it's extracting value. And part of helping with change, I want to go back to what you said, is developing trust. But really, trust comes from rapport, and rapport comes from connection. Connection comes from communication. And it just goes back to authentically and genuinely wanting to not just build something great, but build something great with great people. I think helping people to bring the greatness out of themselves, going back to the change component, building trust helps people to be willing to follow you. I remember having a couple of supervisors where people would say, I follow them because they get in the trenches with you. They're willing to do the work that they're asking you to do. Yep. Granted, their role as a CEO might be different, but they're willing to do that, which makes you willing to kind of step up and support them as well. Yep. Those are all elements, I think, as we talk about change, that a lot of times are because that's where it goes back, like the organizations I work with around conflict resolution, and they were changing or merging with another group. That's what happened. They had already had strained relationships, and every time it happened, or at least the individual said, every time it happens this way. I think being able to pause, and even if the change is inevitable and the merger is going to happen, a lot of folks think the problem is the merger or the change. But you just so eloquently said it is really about recognizing people in the space and preparing them and equipping them.
Yeah. I think as leaders, but you and me as coaches, consultants going into organizations, when you start a change process and you recognize that the trust isn't there, or when you recognize there is conflict or there's a resistance, that's the moment to get curious about where those gaps are, that you either need to shore them up quickly or somehow make sure that the person's concerns are being heard. So if they don't feel trust, what is it? Like, what's the pinpoint that we need to address? What's maybe the boundary we need to put in place? Not as a limit or a set of, bureaucratic red tapey kinds of rules, but how can we create a structure, a container for people to feel more safe so that they can trust here for now? Because change is coming. So what if we create a container where it's a little safer in here for you to trust. And as you see, this is going to be okay. You're going to be heard. We actually recognize what's most important to you. We see your strengths. Then those walls of that container can come down a little bit further and further, and you can trust a little bit more and more. And then the change becomes more, okay, we can all do this together. We are equipped to manage this change, but we got to start maybe smaller if it's whenever possible, in a smaller, safer place, so that then we have some evidence that I'm still safe here. I can still do this. And then you keep going. And if you don't have that for people, it's really hard for individually as well as within a team. It's really hard for them to navigate the change in a way that's not going to create the crisis and the drama and the falling apart. And then if there are people who are not going to be willing to at least give themselves a container, they're probably not going to be able to weather the change that's coming. And that's their choice too.
Leadership plays a role in that. I think you give us a great segue to our next question. What is one thing about change that you wish more leaders knew or practice? And then the second part of that is, what resources do you recommend for anyone who's leading through a time of change? So again, the first part of it is, what is one thing about change that you wish more leaders knew or practice? The second part of that is, what resources do you recommend for anyone who's leading through a time of change?
I'm going to go from my recent experiences with some organizations lately and going through change. I wish more leaders knew that change can happen without crisis. I wish more leaders started with the acknowledgement that change isn't the issue. It's how you do the change that's the issue. Because when we think of change as the issue or change as the problem, that's just a false understanding. Change is going to happen, like it's inevitable. So let's get off this whole, oh no, fear of change, and instead go, okay, oh, here we go. Here's the next change. There's going to be another one in the future. How am I going to do this one? How am I going to go through this? And how am I going to help everyone feel validated for how they're coming to change? How am I going to help everyone feel safe, that we don't all have to our hair is not on fire. We don't have to feel like this is just the worst thing ever, even if it's a really, really difficult emotional change. If we're starting from the perspective of validating where everyone's coming from, we're at a much healthier place for ourselves, and we have more capacity to give our teams and validate every individual and the collective as well. So that's the first answer. Is I would just say, stop focusing on resistance of change or fear of change, and start focusing on, how am I going to respond to change? And how am I going to do it in a way that doesn't need to be crisis or conflict in a bad way, and it can be more about opportunity and response and growth. The other thing that I would say, and this goes to my recent work that you alluded to earlier, I have been developing a self-leadership framework that I have been using for years, and I just haven't articulated it as clearly as I am now. I'm calling it First Lead Yourself. It's very much about, as we lead, typically, we think about service, and we think about helping to make sure that we're supporting our teams, and we're bringing all our skills, all our strengths, all our wisdom to our teams and to our leadership externally. And then we have the leftovers internally. We have the crumbs left, those same skills. We are so many good things going for us. But when we give it to everybody else first, then we're just kind of depleted before we even start looking inward and what do we need. And then that's when we need retreats, and we need to avoid burnout, and we need to find some way to step away. What I've been working on as a framework to articulate, because I've been doing it for a long time, is first starting with ourselves and having a check-in in a regular, routine, intentional way, to circle back around and have a cycle for yourself. I'm going to check in with myself first, acknowledge what I have and that I'm bringing to the table, and then come up with a stronger plan of what's going to happen from there. So the cycle's really easy, and it's reflect, own, plan, act. Giving yourself time to make sure you're reflecting. So a lot of the time what we do is we jump from reflect to act. I'm thinking about it for a minute. I see this, what's going on. Okay, what do I need to do about it? But if we don't stop for a little bit longer and go, okay, this is what's going on. I need to own the good stuff that I'm bringing. I need to own the strengths I have. I need to own the strengths that my team members have. And then from that place of strength, Then we can go into, I need to own where we're falling short. I need to own where we have gaps, where we really need to get better at it. That's all. We need to own that. I need to own where we're aligned on values. And then we can go into a plan, and then we can go into action that is much more impactful. The more we do that cycle on a regular basis, like I set it up beginning and ending of every week, I'll go through that cycle for myself. It means that I have more to give as a leader. And when change comes along, I'm ready for it. It's just become part of my routine. And it's not so much the crisis as it is just, okay, what is my response going to be this time?
The thing that I would think leaders should know is that change can be addressed internally first, internally within the leaders, but also internally within the organization. Usually we're looking outside of ourselves, outside of our abilities out. And what happens is a lot of times we focus on the things that we have no control over. People often say that, but there's so many things that we do have control over. Yeah. There's a power within the organization, a power within you as an individual, that if you tap into it, understand it, and start cultivating that, because it's something you have to practice. There are resources for that. One of the things I think about, because we both do it, is coaching. Mm-hmm. Coaching is a great opportunity to help people to see a different facet of situation, circumstances, but them, right? There are so many tools. One of the things I think about in this space is resilience and resourcefulness. People and organizations are really resilient, but resilience doesn't necessarily make you resourceful. So I think tools that help you to become more resourceful, to know how to use your resources, not only have resources, because often people will say, well, we should have resources to do this. If you don't use them, they won't work. If you don't know how to use them, when to use them, they won't work. That's why with our whole conversation is from perspective to practice. Because sometimes what you think you might say and do and what you actually do are not the same things. So how do we really empower people to, and that goes back to things like the self-determination theory, where when you have choices, when you have competence and skills, and when you can see how things are related, interconnected, how it helps you get to where you're going, it's a game changer. It's a game changer when organizational change, the change from the inside out, because that already changes how I show up. It changes how I perform. It also changes even how things impact or influence me. Right? This happens often when I've done working at conflict resolution. And I was talking about, a lot of times I would share things from the Thomas Kilmann model, where, looking at some of the aspects of assertiveness in terms of change, and just looking at how people view it. And so looking at it as an opportunity versus a challenge already changes how people show up to deal with it. And recognizing that you can have healthy dialogue, not necessarily arguing, but having a healthy dialogue to recognize different positions, different conversations, and different opportunities. As you were speaking, that's kind of what I got was, when we're doing these things on purpose, a lot of the things that we thought was a problem is really an opportunity, and people can get excited about using their skills and their tools and their strategies. And now you have people proactive, not reactive. Now you have folks who are looking for opportunities to help each other, to support each other. This is something that shifts the organization, because now your organization is not in survival mode, but thriving. You got individuals who are thriving, organization who is thriving. You have goals and core values that are aligned. You create a more harmonious and supportive workplace. That's where things like workplace wellness comes in. You have less burnout. You have less turnover. Right? You have less leadership who are misusing their authority and their power. Now you have an organization where people want to come to work, and people feel valued, and people feel like family, and a really healthy perspective of that. So you get a chance to redefine that. And so all that helps with change. So those resources become more about resources to build from the inside out versus the outside in.
And every time you say resources, I think that toolbox that you only use some of the tools in, but the more you are able to stop and go, but I got these other tools too, then more of your tools come into play. And it's wonderful to be able to pull from those too, that you end up having yourself, you're thriving, but your organization also is thriving too.
Yeah.
Awesome. Sometimes at the end of coaching sessions, I just write down a few words, or I look back at my notes and see some words that have popped out. And the words that are popping out from our conversation are communication, trust, strength, resourcefulness, and opportunity. And it just feels like those are some great words to just keep in mind and perspective when change is happening. It's that whole, shifting into that perspective of having that be those kinds of words and that kind of perspective coming. Change just becomes so much more manageable, navigable. And what comes out of change, you can be that much more successful.
We can actually, like, not just using those terms, but like, what do they look like? What do they sound
Absolutely.
like in a workplace environment? And that becomes really helpful and beneficial opportunity to be able to implement and take action.
Yeah, putting them to use, putting them to work. Fantastic. So before we leave our conversation today, what else would you like to say about maybe the work that you've been doing lately, or ways that you can support leaders through change?
Thank you so much. So one is coaching, but another thing I've started really kind of expanding on is I have a group for leadership wellness,
Mhm.
specifically geared toward leaders and the 8 dimensions of wellness, and how by building their wellness into their actual leadership practices, it changes how they show up in their leadership perspective. I'm also doing some work on relaxation. What I found is just people in general are stressed. So I want to intentionally help you and serve you and support you to be more relaxed, so there's less resistance, less stress. What I found is it changes not only how you lead or your own wellness, but it also helps with clarity. It also helps with organization. And so when those things happen, you flow way more in your abilities, skills, gifts, and talents. So that's really helpful. And it helps also relationally, because you show up different in relationships, development, programming, and resources.
Fantastic. And what's the best way to get in touch with you?
You can reach me at robert@wilsongos.com, or you can reach me on Instagram or LinkedIn or Facebook under Dr. Robert L. Wilson.
Awesome. Wonderful. Well, it's always so fantastic to talk with you.
Likewise. Thank you so much.